The wind carried the faint scent of smoke across the desert, curling between the tall red rocks that guarded the Apache lands. By noon, the sun burned white over the canyon, and the sound of hooves echoed far off the ridge. From the dust rose a frail figure on a tired mule, a woman dressed in worn calico, her face shadowed beneath a faded bonnet. She looked as though the world had taken every ounce of strength from her, yet her eyes still carried that stubborn flicker of hope that refused to die. Her name didn't matter much anymore. Folks in the nearby towns only called her the poor widow who lost everything. All she wanted now was work, food, and a roof strong enough to survive the coming storms. For 2 days she had followed the river that wound through Apache country, guided by the whisper of rumor that somewhere beyond the canyons, near the wild lands where few white settlers dared to go, a ranch still stood untouched by war or drought. They said an Apache man ruled that land, half outlaw, half legend. Some called him dangerous, others swore he was a protector of the weak. She didn't care what he was. She needed work, and she would beg if she had to. Her children were gone, her farm was burned, and the town that once pitied her had no place for another hungry mouth. So she rode on, clutching a small bundle wrapped in cloth, the last of her belongings, and perhaps the last piece of her past. When she reached the narrow valley, silence fell. Not a bird sang. The mule stopped, ears twitching. Then came the sound, soft but sharp, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. She froze. From the shadow of a mesquite tree stepped a man tall and broad, skin bronzed by the desert sun, hair falling long to his shoulders. He wore pieces of leather and beads around his neck, and his eyes, dark and steady, studied her like a hawk sizing up its prey. She could feel her heart pounding as he lowered the rifle just a little, enough to show he wasn't going to shoot. Not yet. "You're far from the road," he said in slow, accented English. "White towns are that way." His tone wasn't harsh, but it wasn't kind either. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "I heard you might need help. Someone to cook, clean, mend clothes." "I can do all that, sir. I'll work for food, if nothing else." He looked her over for a long moment, then turned his gaze toward the distant hills. "There's no one here to pay you," he said. "No gold, no house full of servants. Only me." She glanced at the land behind him. A small wooden cabin standing alone against the cliffs, smoke rising from its chimney. A few horses grazed nearby, and she caught sight of the drying hides hanging from poles. It wasn't much, but to her it looked like safety. She took a step forward, clutching her shawl. "Then I'll work for you," she said. "Whatever you need done. I'm not afraid of hard work." He turned back to her, a strange look crossing his face, somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "You want to work for an Apache?" he asked. "No one comes here unless they're running from something." Her voice broke when she answered. "Maybe I am." He said nothing for a while, only watched her. The wind tugged at her dress, lifting the dust around her feet. Finally, he nodded toward the cabin. "Come," he said. "But understand, there are no servants here, no workers. You stay by my rules." She followed him, her hands shaking but her steps steady. Inside the cabin it was clean but sparse, a single table, a fire pit, and furs laid out near the hearth. He motioned for her to sit, then poured water from a jug into a tin cup. She drank slowly, grateful for the taste of something cool after so many miles. For a long while neither spoke. The only sound was the crackling of fire and the whisper of wind through the cracks in the wood. He finally broke the silence. "What did you lose?" he asked, his tone low. She looked at her hands. "A husband. 2 children. The war took one, fever took the other. The land took everything else." His jaw tightened, and for a moment his gaze softened. "You're not the first to lose everything," he said quietly. "Out here, loss makes people hard, sometimes cruel." She nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just need a chance to start again. To live somewhere no one looks at me with pity." He leaned back, studying her carefully. "And what will you do here, widow?" "This isn't a town. There's no church, no shop, no neighbors. Only desert, storm, and me. I can cook," she said, forcing strength into her voice. "I can sew, tend to horses, keep the fire going. I can work from dawn till dark." He smiled faintly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And if I said there's only one job here, when would you still stay?" Her breath caught. "What kind of job?" His gaze lingered on her face, unreadable yet heavy with meaning. "The only job here," he said slowly, "is wife in my bed." She went still. The words hit her like a shot, not cruelly spoken but deeply final, like a truth carved into stone. Her fingers tightened around the cup, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. The fire popped behind her, the mule brayed outside, and still she sat frozen, the air between them thick with something she couldn't name. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her. He only watched, as if waiting to see what she would do. "You came here for work," he said softly. "But you don't understand what kind of place this is. Out there people think Apaches steal, kill, take what they want. Here I build what others destroyed. But I don't take unless someone chooses to stay." Her throat tightened, confusion and fear warring with exhaustion. She wanted to run, but where? The sun was sinking, the desert turning cold. Night in the canyon could kill faster than a bullet. She looked around. At the firs, the walls, the small shelf of dried herbs. Everything about this place told her it was a man who lived alone too long, a man who carried both strength and sorrow. "I don't know you," she whispered. He nodded. "And I don't know you, but I see truth in your eyes. You've been hungry, lost, betrayed by your own kind. I've seen that before." She looked away, her breath trembling. "You can't just say something like that." His voice grew lower, steadier. "I don't lie, widow. If you stay here, you'll eat, you'll sleep safe, but no more running. You'll be mine." Her pulse raced as she stood, backing away toward the door. "I can't do that," she said. "I only came for work." He rose slowly, tall and quiet, his shadow stretching long in the firelight. "Then go before the sun dies," he said. "The wolves come out when darkness falls, and no one will hear you scream in these canyons." Her heart pounded as she turned toward the open door. The last light of day painted the rocks in red and gold, and far in the distance thunder rolled over the mountains. She gripped the doorway, torn between fear of the man behind her and the greater danger waiting outside. She could feel his eyes on her back, could hear the steady rhythm of his breathing. He spoke again, softer this time, almost a whisper. "Or stay, just for the night." She didn't answer. Her fingers trembled on the rough wood, the cold air from outside sweeping across her face. The mule whinnied again, uneasy. She took one last look at the fading light, then turned slowly back toward him, the man who might be her only chance to survive the wilderness. His dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The fire crackled louder. Outside, the wind howled through the rocks. Inside, two souls broken by loss stood facing each other, one seeking shelter, the other something far deeper. The night was coming fast, and whatever she decided now would change everything. The poor widow stood in the doorway, caught between darkness and firelight. The canyon wind hissed like a warning through the dry brush, but the warmth behind her pulled at her heart. She had been cold for too many nights, running from one cruel turn of life to another. The Apache's steady gaze didn't waver, and though his words had struck her like a whip, there was no cruelty in his tone now, only something raw and honest. It scared her, maybe even more than the wilderness outside. She didn't know this man, yet something in his eyes told her he knew suffering as well as she did. Slowly, she stepped back inside, closing the door against the wind. The firelight painted her face in gold and shadow as she stood by the wall, unsure what to do next. He watched her without speaking, then went to the fire and dropped another piece of wood onto the flames. The sparks rose, filling the silence between them. He poured water into a kettle, hung it over the flames, and spoke at last. "Sit," he said. "Eat something before you faint." She obeyed, too weak to argue. Her hands were still trembling when he handed her a tin bowl of stew. The meat was tough, the broth thin, but it tasted like life itself. She ate in silence, aware of his eyes on her, not prying but guarded, like a man used to being alone too long. After a while, he sat down across from her, elbows resting on his knees, and said, "No one comes this far unless they've lost hope." She looked up from the bowl. "Maybe I have. Maybe hope's all I've got left." His lips curved slightly, though not quite into a smile. "Hope feeds no one out here. Only strength does." He stood again, his movements quiet but full of purpose. "You can stay tonight. In the morning, decide if you still want to live on this land." She wanted to ask what he meant, but her body was too tired to question. When he handed her a blanket made of soft deer hide, she clutched it to her chest like something sacred. He spread his own bedroll near the door and laid his rifle beside it. "You sleep by the fire," he said simply. "No one will harm you here." That night she didn't dream. Or maybe she did. But the line between dream and memory had blurred long ago. She saw flashes of her husband's face, the fire that burned their farm, her son's laughter fading into silence. When she woke to the sound of roosters crowing somewhere far off, the Apache was already outside, bare-chested in the cold morning light, breaking ice from the water trough. His hair was damp, His muscles tensed with the motion of his arms as he swung the axe against the frozen wood. For a moment she just watched, unable to look away. There was power in him, not just physical, but something deeper, a kind of untamed calm that belonged to the land itself. When he noticed her standing in the doorway, he nodded toward a bucket near the well. "You'll need water if you plan to stay," he said. Desert doesn't forgive weakness. She hesitated before stepping outside, her bare feet brushing the frost on the ground. "I haven't decided yet," she said softly. He didn't turn to face her. "Then decide fast. The land doesn't wait for anyone." She bent to fill the bucket, her arms aching with the weight. Every small task felt heavy after months of hunger and grief, but somehow the air here felt cleaner, the silence thicker. It was a lonely place, yet something about it made her feel strangely alive. When she carried the water back inside, he was skinning a rabbit near the fire, his hands steady and precise. She turned away, uncomfortable with the sight, though she knew it was survival. He spoke after a while, his tone thoughtful. "I don't take what isn't given. You should know that." She stopped, the bucket still in her hands. "You think I believed you would?" He shrugged. "You looked afraid last night." "I've been afraid for a long time," she whispered. "Doesn't mean I think every man means harm." He met her eyes, and for a moment there was a silence that spoke louder than words. He stood and tossed the skinned rabbit into a pot, then motioned for her to sit again. "Eat with me. Then I'll tell you what this place really is." They ate together in the quiet of the morning, the fire crackling low. When she was done, she asked, "What do you mean by what this place really is? It's just land, isn't it?" He shook his head slowly. "To most, yes. But this land belonged to my people long before the towns came. My father died fighting for it. My brothers are gone. Only I remain here, keeping what's left from being stolen again." She studied his face. The hard lines, the scars faint along his shoulder, the quiet sadness that hid behind his steady voice. "So you live here alone?" "I live," he said simply. That's enough. She could hear the weight behind those words. Living out here wasn't survival. It was endurance. The kind of strength only loss could build. And yet beneath that calm, she sensed something else. The burden of carrying too much sorrow alone. She knew that burden all too well. As the day went on, she helped him with small chores around the cabin. She swept the floor, washed the dishes, and mended a torn shirt she found hanging on the wall. He didn't ask her to, but he didn't stop her either. It was as though they both understood that silence was easier than conversation. By afternoon, she found herself outside, standing near the corral, watching the horses graze. The land stretched endlessly before her, mountains rising like giants, the horizon shimmering under the heat. It was beautiful in a fierce kind of way, free and cruel at the same time. When he joined her, he carried a lasso and a saddle over his shoulder. "These horses were wild once," he said, nodding toward them. "Took months to earn their trust," she smiled faintly. "Seems like you don't trust people as easily." He gave a quiet laugh. "People break trust faster than horses." There was something about his voice then, rough, honest, almost human in its weariness. She turned toward him and said, "Maybe you've just met the wrong kind of people." He glanced at her, eyes narrowing slightly. "And what kind are you, widow?" "The kind that's trying to start over," she said softly. "Even if it means trusting a stranger." The words hung between them, fragile and uncertain. He looked away first, tightening the strap on his saddle. "Then maybe we both start over." Later that evening, the wind rose again. Dust swept across the valley and thunder rolled in the distance. He worked to tie down loose boards on the roof, while she kept the fire alive. When he came back inside, rain was beginning to fall, heavy and cold. His hair was soaked, his skin gleaming under the firelight. She offered him a towel, and their hands brushed for the first time. It was a small touch, brief but charged with something unspoken. Neither pulled away quickly. He sat by the fire drying his hair while she wrapped another blanket around her shoulders. "Storms here come fast," he said. "You'll hear them before you see them," she nodded. "In town I used to be afraid of storms, but now they make me feel small in a good way. Like maybe the world still has something bigger than our pain." He turned his head slightly, studying her face. "You speak like someone who's lost too much to be afraid of anything." "Maybe that's true," she whispered. "When you lose everything, there's nothing left but the will to keep going." He didn't reply. The storm outside grew louder, the walls shaking under the wind's weight. She thought about what he said the night before, about being his wife, about staying. It still echoed in her mind, but she began to understand now that his words weren't just hunger or arrogance. They were loneliness born from years of silence and exile. She felt it in every word he spoke, every quiet look he gave her. This was a man who had lived too long without someone beside him. As night deepened, the rain softened to a steady rhythm. He sat by the window, rifle resting across his knees, watching the dark horizon. She wanted to ask why he kept it so close, but before she could, he said, "There are men who come through these lands, trappers, soldiers, thieves. Not all of them mean well. If you stay here, you'll need to be ready for that." She frowned. "Ready how?" "To defend yourself," he said. "And this place." She looked at him uneasy. "Why me?" He turned from the window, meeting her gaze. "Because you already know what it's like to fight to survive." She said nothing after that, only sat near the fire until her eyes grew heavy. When she finally drifted to sleep, the sound of rain mixed with the steady crackle of the fire, and somewhere outside, a wolf howled. The Apache didn't move from his post by the window. His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness, alert, patient, as though he was guarding more than just the land. Perhaps he was guarding her too. And though she didn't know it yet, that night would mark the beginning of something neither of them had expected, a bond born not from comfort or promise, but from the quiet ache of two lost souls finding their way through the wilderness. Morning came with a sky washed clean by rain, and the land smelled of wet sage and cold stone. The poor widow woke before the rooster and set a kettle on the coals, listening for any sound from outside the cabin. The Apache moved like part of the light, already in the yard with a bridle in hand, checking the horses and scanning the ridge. She watched the way he studied the horizon, slow and cautious, as if the mountains could hide trouble behind each fold. She had lived among townsfolk who talked loud and showed their fear with sharp words. This man spoke little, but fear and duty had carved the same lines on his face, only quieter. It made her uneasy, and yet she trusted it more than any cheerful lie. He asked for her help bringing in dried meat and sorting herbs he had gathered in the hills. She did the work with steady hands, grateful for task and purpose. As they moved around each other, the conflict from the first night sat between them like a third presence. He had told her what staying meant. She had not agreed. He did not raise it again, but she could feel the question in every silence. Out here, bargains were as hard as the land, and so were the stakes. Still, something kept her near the fire and not the road. Maybe it was the sound of wolves at dusk. Maybe it was the way he slept by the door with a rifle across his chest, guarding the cabin like a man guarding a grave and a home all at once. That afternoon, a rider's shape appeared on the far ridge, a black mark against the pale sky. The Apache saw it first. He set his hand on the widow's shoulder and guided her deeper inside. "Do not stand in the window," he said. "Stay where the shadows hold you." She wanted to argue, to say she was no stranger to men on the road, but his tone left no room. He stepped out not with the rifle but with an old bow, its string oiled and silent. The rider turned, then another followed, and another, until 3 horses worked down the draw. The men wore broad hats and coats flapping like torn flags. One had a red bandana at his neck. They came to the corral and reined up with spurs, talking in the dust. The one in front spoke first, a grin too easy on his face. "Heard there's a good spring here," he said. "Water runs thin this side of the ridge." The Apache's answer was plain. "You can water your horses and go." The men looked past him toward the cabin, even though the widow stayed hidden, and that made her skin prickle. The second rider pushed his hat back. "We're hunting strays," he said. "Cattle." He glanced at the hides drying on the poles. "Looks like you're hunting too." "Deer," the Apache said. "No cattle cross here." The third rider circled along the fence, slow and nosy. The widow could not see his eyes, only the way his shoulders sloped like a man who did not plan to work if he could take. The front man laughed easy and asked for salt, for tobacco, for news. The Apache gave none of those. He stood with that desert stillness that was more warning than a shouted threat. After a time, the men drank, spat, and swung back into their saddles. As they turned, the red bandana man said, "If you see a woman on the road, send her toward the river. We pay for good help." The Apache's face did not change. "No one passes here." They rode off then, but the widow did not breathe easy. She waited until the horses were specks and the dust settled into the scrub again. Only when he came inside did she find her voice. "They knew," she said. "Or guessed." He set the bow down and nodded. "The land tells men more than words. A mule, fresh footprints, smoke from a second meal. They would have smelled you even if they had no eyes. Her fear shifted into anger. You could have sent me out with them. You could have told me to go. I did, he said. The first night. She flinched at that, remembering the choice he had put before her. He poured water into a cup, handed it to her, and softened his tone. If you go with men like that, you will not find work and bread. You will find chains. This valley is cruel, but it does not lie. The day wore on with a strange heaviness. The widow tied up her hair and worked at the wash, but her mind ran ahead, tracing paths out of the canyon and down to the river, to the trading post, and the small church with its old bell. She pictured the faces in town, how they would look at her hunger and her torn shoes, and she did not like what she saw. A thought came to her that felt dangerous to hold. Maybe the worst thing here was not the wilderness but the fact that she had nowhere else to belong. By evening she learned why the Apache slept with a rifle. The wind shifted and carried smoke from the north. Not the clean kind from a cooking fire, but the thick, bitter kind that comes from brush set to burn. He sniffed the air and tensed. They are driving game, he said. Or they are sending a message. He banked the fire in the hearth, checked the door, and gave her a small knife to wear at her belt. He showed her where an old trail slipped out the back of the cabin and wound to a narrow cleft in the rock. If men come, he said, take this path and wait where the cave mouth opens to the creek. If I fall, follow the water until you reach Cottonwoods. Then keep going till you hear the bell from the trading post. She looked at him, and the world spun with new weight. I don't know the land the way you do, she said. You will, he answered. The smoke line faded with night and left only the hiss of crickets. Still, the warning had done its work. The widow could not shake the feeling of being hunted by more than hunger. She needed to understand who the Apache was and why these hills stirred so much trouble. When he finally sat with her near the coals, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest. What did you mean when you said you build what others destroyed? He stared into the fire long enough for her to think he would not answer. When he did, his voice came low. Once my family kept many horses. We moved with the seasons and the water. Then the war came to these mountains. Even if no flag was planted here, soldiers wanted the pass, miners wanted the river, cattlemen wanted the grass and the salt lick. My father would not move. They burned the lodge, shot the mares, cut down the old cottonwood where the bones of our elders hung in peace. His jaw clenched, but his eyes stayed dry. They said it was a lesson. The widow felt shame rise in her throat even though she had done none of those things. How did you live through it, she asked, the words barely sound. By learning the shape of loss, he said, and by counting small victories. A foal born strong, a spring that did not fail, a winter survived. I pull what I can from the ground and from the animals, and I keep this piece from being swallowed. Her mind turned through this history and found its own thread. So, when you said the only job here is wife, you were not only talking about hunger or heat. No, he said. I was speaking of choosing a side. This valley against the road, my life against the emptiness. Marriage here is not only a bed. It is two backs against the same door. His truth did not make the choice simpler. It made it heavier. She thought of her lost family, of the small cross she had carved into the post where the field once stood, and of the way the townspeople had drifted away from her like smoke each time she asked for work. If she stayed here, she would be turning her back on that old world. If she left, she might be walking toward the same men who set fires for sport. The next day brought more proof that lines were being drawn. Near noon, a mail wagon rattled down the lower trail, the driver tight-mouthed, a woman sitting beside him with a shawl pulled high against the dust. The Apache stepped out where they could see him. The driver lifted a hand, wary but not unkind. We're headed to the post, he said. Word is there's a bounty on a man who runs cattle across the ridge without a brand. If you see any strangers taking beef through your water, you keep your head low. He looked past the Apache to the cabin door where the widow stood. His eyes softened with quick pity. Ma'am, best you ride inside the wagon and let me take you to town. There's talk of men from the south setting claims where they have no deeds. Before she could speak, the Apache said, She is safe. The driver pressed his lips thin, weighing whether to argue, then flicked the reins. The wheels groaned and the wagon lurched ahead, leaving the widow with a new storm in her chest. A bounty, men from the south, a claim without deed. She realized the conflict she had stepped into was larger than a cabin and a proposition. It was the border where law bent to the strongest hand and the oldest roots. That afternoon, the widow searched the cabin shelves, hungry for a way to belong that did not cost her soul. She found a wooden box with a broken lid, Inside lay a coil of horsehair rope, a small bone needle, and a folded cloth she recognized at once as a medicine wrap. She had watched a healer use something like it on her child long ago. When the Apache came in, she held it up. "I know how to stitch and bind," she said. "I can mix tallow with crushed herbs to keep a wound from rotting. If you take in strays and fight wolves and face men on the trail, you need a second pair of hands who knows more than cooking." He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once, as if they had signed a paper. He did not thank her, yet the air between them warmed. In the days that followed, she proved her words. She grafted a split hoof, boiled a salve, reworked the cabin shelf so the tools sat where a hand could find them in the dark. She learned the short whistle he used for the gray horse and the grunt that calmed the skittish mare. He taught her the shape of the valley, the safe rocks, the places where water lingered after a storm. Each lesson braided them tighter and made the choice harder. The first real test came when a stray boy wandered into the yard at dusk, thin as wire and full of hollow courage. He said he had lost his uncle near the pass and had not eaten since the night before. The widow saw dust in the creases of his eyelids and how his hands shook even when he tried to hide it. She fed him broth and bread and asked no questions. The Apache, however, studied the boy like a map. 2 hours later, the boy confessed that his uncle had stolen 3 calves and traded them to men with a red bandana for whiskey. The boy had run when the deal went bad. The widow's stomach turned cold. The Apache never raised his voice. He set a bowl in front of the boy and said, "Eat. At dawn I will walk you to the post." That night, the widow argued in a whisper by the hearth. "If you take him to the post, they will ask where he found shelter. Those men will come here." The Apache did not blink. "If we hide him, we belong to the lawless. If we hand him over, we belong to the talk of towns. Either way, we are seen." She stared into the coals until her eyes hurt. "Then what do we belong to?" she asked. He looked past her shoulder to the door. "To the land," he said. "And to whatever promise we make inside it." Near midnight, coyotes sang across the draw. The boy slept in a corner with a blanket tucked to his chin. The widow could not rest. She traced the cracks in the wall and the curve of the Apache's bow and thought of the word he had given her on the first night. Wife. It had sounded like a chain then. Now it sounded like a fort. The difference frightened her. She woke to hoofbeats. The Apache stood already at the window, shadowed and tall. He put a finger to his lips and whispered one word. "Riders." She moved to wake the boy. He shook his head and pointed to the back trail. She understood. She led the boy by the arm through the narrow path to the cleft, the stone cold and wet under her fingers. Behind them, the cabin door opened with a soft creak. She looked back once and saw the Apache step outside into gray light, rifle laid against his forearm like a quiet truth. She pressed the boy into the shelter of rock and crouched low, heart thudding, breath held against the cold. Voices carried thin on the wind, the tone lazy, the edges cruel. The red bandana voice laughed at something she could not hear. A second voice asked for tobacco. Then came the scrape of a boot against the porch, and the pause of men deciding whether a man alone would be easy to push. The widow felt the boy's fingers tighten on her wrist. She stared toward the mouth of the cave where a slice of morning showed the world in hard silver. Somewhere far off, the church bell at the trading post rang once and went quiet. In that bare sound, the whole fight of the frontier seemed to balance on a knife. The poor widow knew the next minutes would choose her fate as surely as any prayer. Ahead lay the old road and pity with a price. Behind lay the cabin and the man who guarded both her sleep and his dead. The riders dismounted. Spurs rattled. A hand pounded the doorframe. The Apache answered, voice low enough that she could not hear the words. The boy looked to her with eyes wide as coins. She did not move. She did not breathe. She waited for the choice to rise from inside her like spring water from stone, praying it would come before the men decided for her. The wind carried the scent of rain and gun oil as the poor widow crouched in the cleft, holding the trembling boy close. Her heart beat so hard it hurt, each thump louder than the thunder in the distance. The Apache stood somewhere beyond her sight, facing the riders who had come to his land without welcome. Every instinct in her screamed to run, but something deeper, something stronger, kept her rooted. She could not leave him alone, not after everything she had seen in his eyes. Outside, the men's voices grew louder.
"You alone out here, Redskin?"
One called out. "We saw smoke last night. Don't look like one man's work." Boots scraped against stone. A horse snorted. Another voice followed lower, harder. "He's lying. There's someone else here. Maybe that widow the driver told us about." The widow's breath caught. So they had known. The wagon driver's warning had reached the wrong ears. She could almost see their faces, men who smiled as they robbed, laughed as they burned, the kind who turned hunger into a weapon. She pressed the boy's head down, whispering for silence. The rock was cold under her palms, grounding her while fear threatened to take over. Then came the sound that froze her blood, the sharp click of a rifle being drawn. The Apache's voice answered, calm and clear. "You should leave this place." The leader's laugh echoed through the canyon. "You don't tell us what to do, half-breed. Word is you've been keeping cattle that ain't yours. Maybe even keeping women who ain't yours either." The widow's fingers dug into the boy's arm. He looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, but she shook her head. No movement, no sound. The rain began to fall again, soft at first, tapping against the rocks like the steady drum of warning. A silence stretched, heavy as a drawn bowstring. Then a voice snapped, "Search the place!" She heard boots thudding on the porch, the crash of something knocked over inside the cabin. Her heart pounded harder. Every second stretched too long, too thin. The boy tried to shift, but she held him still, whispering again, "Don't move. Whatever happens, don't make a sound." A shot cracked through the storm. Then another. Echoes rolled through the valley like thunder made of fire. She gasped and almost ran, but forced herself to stay low. The boy buried his face against her shoulder, his body shaking. She counted the seconds, praying for silence, praying for a sign that he was still alive. Then, quiet. Only the wind and the hiss of rain. She crept forward, every step slow, every breath measured. The trail down from the cave twisted along the rocks, slick with water. When she reached the bend, she saw the cabin. One side splintered from a bullet, smoke rising from the chimney, and a shape moving in the yard. The Apache stood there, rifle in hand, his hair soaked and clinging to his shoulders. One man lay sprawled near the fence, unmoving. The others were gone. Their horses vanished into the rain. She ran to him before she could stop herself. "Are you hurt?" He turned, eyes dark as storm clouds. There was a cut across his arm, blood mixing with rain, but he didn't flinch. "Not bad," he said. "They'll come back." "They always do." She looked at the dead man, his face hidden beneath mud. "You could have killed them all." "I could have," he said quietly. "But they'd bring more next time. Men like that don't die alone. They carry their hate like a chain." He looked toward the ridge, where the sound of thunder covered the retreating hoofbeats. "They'll tell others there's a woman here. That's what will bring them back." The widow swallowed hard. "Then we have to leave." He shook his head. "If I leave this land, it dies with me, and so does every promise I made to those who are gone." She stared at him, rain streaking her face. "Then what about me? What about that boy? If they come back, they'll kill us all." He met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw something like doubt in his eyes. "You said you wanted a place to start over," he said. "You asked for work, for a roof, for a reason to stay. This is that place, but the world won't let it live unless we fight for it." His words cut through her fear, though she wished they hadn't. She didn't want to fight again. She had buried enough of the past to fill a graveyard. Yet deep down, she knew running would mean losing herself all over again. The boy's small voice broke the silence. "I can help," he said softly. "I can watch the trail." The Apache looked at him, not unkindly. "You can help by surviving." He turned toward the barn, motioning for them to follow. Inside, he gathered supplies, old ammunition, rope, and a saddlebag of dried food. The widow noticed his hands trembling slightly as he wrapped the wound on his arm. "Let me do that," she said, stepping closer. He didn't resist. She cleaned the cut with water and herbs, her fingers steady though her heart raced. When she tied the bandage, she said quietly, "You risked your life for me." He looked up. "You're on my land. I don't abandon what's mine." Her breath caught. "You don't own me." His jaw tightened. "No, but you're under my protection now. That means something here." She wanted to be angry, but the way he said it, not as a claim but as a vow, silenced her. It wasn't ownership. It was the kind of promise a man makes when he's already lost too much. By nightfall, the storm broke. They sat by the fire, the boy asleep beside them. The Apache cleaned his rifle in silence, his eyes on the flames. The widow couldn't stop her thoughts from racing. Every sound outside made her flinch. The crack of wood, the rush of wind, the cry of a coyote. She wondered how many men were out there, waiting for dawn to finish what they'd started. She spoke softly, almost to herself. "When I lost my family, I thought the worst part was the loneliness. But it wasn't. It was the silence afterward, the kind that makes you wonder if anyone remembers you existed at all." He didn't look up, but his voice was gentle. I remember everyone I've lost. That's how they stay alive. She turned toward him. Then you understand why I can't lose again. He met her eyes across the fire. Then don't. Something in the way he said it, calm, certain, steadied her. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt like she wasn't drifting. Yet even as that feeling took root, the night betrayed it. The horses screamed first. Then came the sharp crack of a gunshot, closer this time, from the ridge above the cabin. The Apache sprang to his feet, rifle in hand, eyes flashing with grim focus. They came sooner than I thought, he said. Stay with the boy. Don't move unless I call. But she followed him anyway, out into the dark. The rain had stopped, but mist clung to the ground, turning the world into a ghost of gray and shadow. 2 torches burned near the fence line. Men's shapes moved against the light, 3, maybe 4. One of them shouted, "We ain't leaving without that woman, Apache!" Her stomach turned cold. So it was her they wanted now. The Apache crouched behind a wagon, reloading. They think you're worth money, he said in a low voice. Maybe to sell, maybe to use. Doesn't matter. They won't leave without proof they own what they came for. I'll go, she whispered. Maybe they'll let you live. He turned sharply, eyes burning in the torchlight. No, you go, they kill me anyway. You stay, maybe we both live. Another shot rang out, splintering the wagon beside them. The air smelled of smoke and fear. The Apache raised his rifle, fired once, and one of the torches fell. A man screamed. The widow ducked, covering her ears as the sound echoed through the canyon. Then the boy's voice called from inside the cabin. They're coming from the back! The Apache swore under his breath and ran toward the porch. The widow followed, tripping over the wet ground. The door burst open and 2 men lunged inside. She grabbed the knife he had given her days ago and struck at the nearest one. The blade cut across his sleeve, enough to make him stumble. The Apache swung the rifle like a club, knocking the second man to the floor. The fight was raw, clumsy, desperate, no room for mercy. The widow backed against the wall, shaking, the knife still in her hand. One of the men grabbed the boy, dragging him toward the door. The Apache raised his gun, but the man pulled the boy in front of him like a shield. You shoot and the kid dies, he shouted. The fire flickered, throwing their faces into sharp light. The boy's eyes were wide, filled with terror. The widow felt something inside her snap. She moved without thinking, grabbing the hot kettle from the fire and flinging it at the man's arm. He screamed. The boy broke free, and in that heartbeat, the Apache fired. The man fell hard, silence crashing down after the shot. Smoke filled the room, thick and stinging. The widow dropped the kettle, her hands shaking. The Apache looked at her, then at the boy, then out the door into the night. More are coming, he said. We have to end this now before dawn. The widow's voice trembled. How? There's more of them than us. His eyes met hers, calm but fierce. Then we stopped being prey. Outside, torches burned brighter, men shouting orders into the dark. The widow could see the outlines of horses moving down the slope. The Apache tightened his bandage, loaded the last of his bullets, and handed her a small revolver. If they break the line, he said, aim for the ones in front. Don't think, just breathe. She took it with both hands, the metal heavy and cold. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the same fire she'd once buried with her past, the one that had kept her alive this long. As the first torch rolled down the hill and the men began to spread, the widow and the Apache took their places, 2 souls against the storm that had finally come for them. The night roared with the sound of hooves and gunfire, and the air filled with smoke and sparks. And in that wild moment, as the mountains echoed with the cry of battle, both of them knew there was no turning back. The desert had chosen its reckoning, and before dawn, someone would not rise again. Gunfire echoed through the valley like thunder splitting the sky. The Apache crouched behind the corral fence, firing into the shadows while the poor widow clung to the revolver in shaking hands. Sparks flew from the dry boards, horses screamed in panic, and the night turned into a storm of smoke and light. Every heartbeat was a battle between fear and courage. She saw him move through the chaos like part of the wind, silent, precise, protecting both her and the boy with a will stronger than steel. The smell of gunpowder filled the air, heavy and bitter. The widow fired once, then again, barely hearing her own shots over the roar. When the last echo faded, the world fell silent except for the crackle of burning wood and the ragged sound of breathing. The boy whimpered, clutching her skirt. Are they gone? He asked. She wanted to say yes, but her voice caught. The Apache stood in the doorway, smoke curling around him, his rifle hanging loose in his hand. For a moment she thought he was unhurt. Then she saw the dark stain spreading down his side. He staggered but stayed upright, his eyes scanning the ridge to be sure the danger was over. Only then did his body give way. She ran to him, catching him before he fell. His skin burned with fever and his breath came short. "Stay with me," she whispered. "You're safe now," he managed a weak smile. "Safe is a word the desert doesn't know," he said. "But maybe tonight it owes us peace." She helped him inside, laying him near the fire where the light turned his skin to bronze and shadow. The boy fetched water while she tore a strip from her dress to bind the wound. Her hands were steady, but her heart trembled. "Don't you dare die," she said. "Not after all this." He gripped her wrist, his strength fading but his voice still firm. "You've got courage," he said. "More than most men I've known. The land will listen to you now." She blinked through tears. "Don't talk like that. You're not going anywhere." Outside, dawn began to bleed across the sky. The smoke from the burned torches drifted into the air, mixing with the pale gold light. The valley looked wounded but alive. The birds that had vanished during the fight returned, timid at first, then louder, as if the land itself was breathing again. The boy sat near the doorway watching the horizon. "They won't come back," he said quietly. "They lost too many." The widow didn't answer. She focused on the Apache, washing the blood from his side, whispering words she didn't know she remembered. Small prayers her mother once said in a town that no longer existed. He didn't move much, but when he did, it was to reach for her hand. She let him hold it, her fingers fitting into his as though they had always belonged there. The hours passed slow. The wound bled less and his breathing grew steadier. When he finally opened his eyes again, the light had changed, warmer now, touching his face like mercy. "You stayed," he said. She nodded. "I told you I don't run anymore." He looked at her for a long moment, his eyes soft, unreadable. "Then this land is yours too," he said. "You fought for it." She shook her head. "I fought for life, and for the only people left in mine." He smiled faintly. "That's what this land has always asked, to be lived for, not owned." The next day they buried the dead near the edge of the valley where the river bent toward the plains. The boy carved simple markers from wood, and the widow laid stones at their feet. The Apache watched in silence, his arm bound tight, a band of leather across his chest. When the last grave was done, the widow turned to him and said, "What now?" He looked toward the mountains, their peaks glowing red under the evening sun. "Now we live," he said. "That's harder than fighting," and so they began again. The cabin was rebuilt slowly. New boards cut from cedar, a stronger roof, new hinges for the door. The widow took care of the boy, who stayed as if he had always belonged there. She mended, cooked, and learned the rhythm of the land. The Apache taught her how to read the sky for storms, how to track animals by their prints, and how to listen to silence, because silence, he said, could tell her more than words. Over time, the valley changed. Grass grew where fire had burned, and the horses returned to the corral, calmer than before. Travelers sometimes passed by, but they never lingered long. Word spread that the place was guarded by a man who didn't fear death, and a woman who survived it. Those who meant harm kept their distance. One evening, weeks later, the widow stood by the river washing clothes. The water was cold, the sound soft and steady. She looked up and saw the Apache on the ridge watching the sunset. He still carried the same quiet strength, but something gentler lived in his face now. A kind of peace she had never seen before. She climbed the hill to stand beside him. "Do you ever wish you'd left?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. He picked up a handful of sand, let it run through his fingers. "No," he said. "This land took everything from me once. Now it gives it back piece by piece." She smiled faintly. "You think that's what it's doing for me too?" He turned to her. "It already has. You came here looking for work. You found a life." She looked out over the valley, the cabin with smoke rising from its chimney, the horses grazing near the creek, the boy chasing a rabbit through the tall grass. "I didn't expect to find peace here," she said. "I didn't even think I deserved it. You earned it," he said. "The land forgives those who stay true to it." The wind lifted her hair, warm and dry. She felt something settle inside her. Not joy, not sorrow, but something steady and right. For the first time in years, she wasn't waiting for the next loss. She was simply living. That night, they ate by the fire outside the cabin. The stars came out bright, sharp, and endless. The boy fell asleep leaning against her shoulder. The Apache sat across from her, his gaze on the flames. "When I first saw you," he said, "I thought you were another ghost the desert sent to test me. She laughed softly. And now? Now I think you were sent to remind me that not everything lost stays gone. They sat in silence after that, listening to the wind in the pines. The world around them felt larger and quieter than ever before. It was a different kind of silence, not empty, but full of life. Days turned into weeks and weeks into months. The seasons changed, painting the land in colors of survival, gold in summer, copper in fall, silver in winter. Each day brought its share of work, but also small moments of grace. The widow began to smile again, not out of habit, but from a place that felt new. The boy grew stronger, faster, and the Apache scars faded, though the memory of that night never did. Sometimes at dusk, he would tell stories of the old world, of his father, his tribe, the battles and songs that had shaped their people. She listened, learning to hear not just the words but the spaces between them. In return, she told him of her past, the farm, her children, the years of hunger and loss. Their stories wove together like two threads in the same cloth, rough but strong. One morning, after the first spring rain, the widow stood on the porch watching the horizon. The sky stretched wide and clean. She thought of all she had lost and all she had found here. Strength, home, purpose, and something close to love. The Apache stepped beside her, his hand brushing hers. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. The land itself seemed to speak for them, whispering through the grass and the flowing creek. In the distance, the boy laughed, his voice carrying across the valley. The widow smiled, her heart finally light. She looked at the man beside her, the one she once feared, the one who had risked his life to protect her, and said softly, "Maybe this land doesn't just belong to you anymore." He looked at her and nodded. Maybe it never did. Maybe it's been waiting for us both. The wind rose again, gentle and warm, sweeping through the canyons, carrying with it the ashes of what had been lost and the breath of what had begun anew. The sun climbed higher, spilling light over the cabin, the river, and the quiet souls who had found a way to survive together. And in that light, the poor widow who had come seeking work and the Apache who had guarded his lonely world stood side by side, no longer bound by the past but shaped by it. Proof that even in the harshest wilderness, hearts can find their way home.